video. I just wanted to give all of you contractors listening out there a special thanks on behalf of the entire Bradford White family. Your commitment, hard work, and dedication in the front lines during this pandemic certainly does not go unnoticed. So again, thank you, and I hope you enjoy the short clip from everyone here at Bradford White.
All right. Thank you, Sean. Also with us today is Ron Shanover from Milwaukee Tool. Hang on, let me go ahead and Ron is on self-mute. Ron, if you're there, you can go ahead and there you go.
Here I am.
There you are. Say a few words for us, please, if you would.
Sure. Thanks, Tim. Thanks for having us. This is Ron Shanover with Milwaukee Tool. I'm sure most everybody here knows who I am. So I just want to say how grateful we are to be a part of this, how much we appreciate our partnership with PHCC and the UAC, and we look forward to many happy days ahead, especially after some of the days that we've looked back on. So I hope everybody's doing well. Can't wait to get face to face again and move forward. And if there's anything you ever need, you know how to get a hold of me. So thanks for that.
All right. Thank you, Ron. And we'll go ahead and show their video.
It starts with a focus on our users.
I think Milwaukee Tool is the brand that is most dedicated to the trades.
We chose to innovate each and every product we come out with from the ground up.
We need to continue to disrupt. We need to continue to change the game. We must innovate or die, and we believe it.
There's no complacency, none.
We embrace change. We are always looking for better ways, better methods, better processes.
We clearly believe we have a unique culture, and I think we all believe it is the reason why we have grown to the level that we have grown and why we have accomplished the things that we have.
We understand the people are the most important resource in developing a good product.
This is who we are. This is how we are going to define ourselves.
It's what Milwaukee's about, building the best, and they're the best what they do.
When we think of our business, we don't think of ourselves as a power tool company or an accessory company or a hand tool company. We think of ourselves as a solution provider, and that's very different.
All right, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker for today, Mr. Harry Sakaris.
Thanks, Tim, and good afternoon, everyone. Tim, have you transferred over to my screen?
I will just now. There you go, sir.
Great, thank you. And let me start by thanking everyone for attending this afternoon. Hopefully this will be informative and educational as we work through what really is becoming more and more of a new normal for most of us. We are in uncharted waters, and that makes it a challenge for us to move forward and understand what our obligations are as we get into negotiations with the labor unions. What we're going to do today is talk a little bit about what the law is governing negotiations in a crisis situation. It's a little bit different, but probably not much different from what you're accustomed to. We'll then spend a little bit of time talking about what alternatives there are when you're planning for negotiations, virtual meetings versus face-to-face meetings, and what considerations you should give to what fits your circumstance best. And then we'll talk about some of the strategy and the topics that we're finding in negotiations these days. And hopefully we'll get to the end of our hour and have time for some questions from you all. But the place where we always start, in my mind, is the legal framework. So where are we? How do we get started? And the first place we look is the statute. And Section 8D of the NLRA tells us that we have a mutual obligation, both the employer and the employee's representative, to meet at reasonable times and confer in good faith with respect to wages, hours, and terms and conditions of employment. The current situation really hasn't changed that obligation. There's nothing either in the statute or in case law that would allow us to differ from this basic framework. However, right at the start of the pandemic in March of this year, the general counsel for the NLRB issued a memo. It's memo 20-04, which discusses the duty to bargain in the emergency circumstances. And the memo breaks down the situations into two different assessments: public emergencies and individual business emergencies. In the context of public emergencies, the memo discusses really what is the test and how the test can be applied. So in basic terms, the test is that there must be extraordinary events which are unforeseen which are an unforeseen occurrence having an immediate economic effect requiring the company to take action. So in one of the cases that was discussed, the employer was involved in a hurricane, and the business shut down, laid off employees immediately following an evacuation order from the state. And the board in that context ruled that in taking that action, the company did not violate the law by evacuating. But down the road, a few days later, when the emergency had cleared and the employer brought in some supervisory personnel basically to clean up and effectuate a more reasonable shutdown, the board held that in that context, the employer did violate the act because the crisis was over and they should have either brought back bargaining unit employees to perform the work, but instead decided to do the work with supervisors. But since the emergency had passed, the company violated the act by doing the work without union employees. Similarly, in a similar situation, and actually the same hurricane, there was an employer who decided to provide what we're hearing now called hazard pay to its bargaining unit employees that stayed on during the hurricane to work work through the situation, and the board there ruled that the employer violated the act by unilaterally changing its wage rates and implementing this hazard pay for these employees. The case that I think is most interesting and probably provides us the most guidance is that there was a plant that closed for 2 days following an ice storm and a local order that essentially shut down the roads and outlawed all unnecessary travel. In that context, the plant was shut down for 2 days. The employer decided to pay its non-represented employees, but to require the represented employees to either elect to use personal days, paid time off, or to take the time as unpaid. As it always happens in these fact patterns, there were 2 contracts, 2 units at issue. One had a contract in place. In the other case, the employees were working under an expired contract. The board concluded that in the contract that was in place, because the ongoing contract had nothing in it about emergency situations and had a very tight zipper clause that allowed the employer to take unilateral action to operate its business, in that context, there was no violation of the act. But in the context where the contract had expired, there was a violation because wages lost due to weather is a mandatory subject of bargaining, and there was no, since there was no contract in effect, there was nothing that the employer could rely on to make that unilateral decision. In the context of individual emergencies, the board has also held that where there's a financial emergency at stake, although it may excuse an employer from decisional bargaining, it does not excuse the obligation to bargain over the effects of a closing. And likewise, in a situation where a health institution implemented a policy that required nurses who had not received certain immunizations to take medication and wear protective gear, the board said that even though that may seem like a public emergency for that individual employer, it was distinguishable from other cases where the board had held that an employer can take some unilateral action. So what these cases teach us is that we really need to look at our contracts. So the duty to bargain still exists. For contracts that are in place, the employer needs to consider what are the obligations and what actions are you permitted to take under a contract, and also understand what is the union's right to seek bargaining over mandatory subjects that are not covered or not precluded by the contract, particularly in the situation where there's no zipper clause. For expiring contracts and contracts that are just coming up for negotiation in the normal course, we're really seeing a couple of different trends, and it really depends on where your unions are, where the workforce is in these discussions. For the most part, we're seeing unions looking to negotiate just as part of the normal bargaining cycle, and we'll talk a little bit about this in detail, simply looking to keep pace with contracts that settled in the last year or two. There are some unions that are looking for new subjects to be added into the contracts to address these kinds of emergency and safety situations. And there's some unions that are being contentious and trying to leverage the public sentiment that's out there, looking to get grab the attention of the media. So what does that mean for us as we look to negotiate? Well, the parameters really haven't changed. We really just have to figure out how it is that we want to proceed. And the questions that we're going to have to answer initially is, we need to meet, we need to agree on where to meet, when to meet, and how to meet. And so the question becomes, well, can we meet in person, or do we have to consider something that is virtual or maybe a little bit out of the ordinary? If we're going to meet, what are the timing considerations? How much time should we invest in meeting, whether it's face-to-face and or virtual? And then in the big picture, if we're going to meet face-to-face, can we meet to satisfy the local and practical limitations that are placed upon us, during the pandemic? There are a lot of unions and a lot of federal agencies pushing the virtual world. So when we look at, are we able to negotiate virtually? Are we able to do this using technology? The first thing that we need to assess, that you all need to assess, is will all the participants be able to participate effectively? Do they have a computer or other device that's going to allow them to participate? They're going to need perhaps a webcam, perhaps audio access. Do they have sufficient internet bandwidth? Is the connection reliable? Do they have a quiet place where they can participate from? Believe it or not, lighting is an issue. The very first Zoom call that I participated in back in March, I had my camera set up facing me, and my picture window, the dining room window, was behind me. Well, that just created a shadow for my presence, and people were complaining, I can't see you, I can hear you, but I can't see you. So I had to figure out a way to reconfigure my setup so that I could be seen and participate. Some places are using virtual backgrounds. For those of you that are familiar with Zoom, you can either substitute a flat image of yourself instead of engaging in the actual video portion of the discussions, or there's some places that are using a virtual background, which is essentially a green screen. And there's some companies that have invested in these virtual backgrounds that have their logos and pictures that can be displayed, or I know Zoom offers a couple of virtual backgrounds that are similar to what you might find in your computer service, where you can pick a background that's piping or a nature scene or something along those lines. Once you've determined that that you're going to be able to have appropriate technological access, then the question is, how do we exchange documents? Those of us that have been doing negotiation for a long time understand that this is a very document intensive, paper intensive exchange of information. But if we're not face to face, and I can't walk in with my trial bag filled with proposals for discussion, how are those proposals going to be exchanged? Do those exchanges occur before the meeting? Are you comfortable using something like we're using today, where the proposing party can share their proposal on the screen, but not necessarily have it distributed or disseminated to the other parties? When we're face to face, there's usually a note taker for each side. But now that we're virtual, do we want a record of the proceedings? Do we want the proceedings recorded so that we can maybe share what's communicated with others who are not present at the negotiations? And most important is, we need to know who's participating. We want to know who's going to have access to this meeting information. We really need someone who knows how to use the mute button, because there are some discussions that may need to be had outside of the presence of others, or outside of the hearing of others. And we need to decide who's going to host the meeting. Are we going to have a neutral host? For example, and I'll get back to the ground rules in a second, are we going to use a mediator, or if we're not going to use a mediator, do we want to take a advantage of some of the technology that's offered by an entity like the FMCS, the Federal Mediation and Conciliation Service? They are looking to provide platforms, and in fact, this morning, as I was going through my email messages, I got a blast message from FMCS, because I'm on their distribution list, that they now have ground rules and mediation and negotiation and arbitration agreements that when parties are agreeing to use their services or to participate in mediation through them, whether it be a case mediation or contractual mediation, their agreements have now been updated to address some of these issues. Skipping back up to ground rules, we need to consider if we're meeting virtually, are we going to allow one or more participants to be together? I assume it's voluntary, but I've been involved in negotiations where the parties can't find a way to meet together, but the union's committee is in one room, our committee is in another room, but we're communicating virtually through the computers. If that's going to be the case, are there ground rules in terms of who can participate, how many participants there should be, how are we going to exchange information and documents, and who's going to control the meeting platform, who's going to provide it, how is it going to be paid for? Is there a way to share those expenses? And most importantly, when we're meeting or negotiating in a virtual setting, probably most of the work in negotiations gets done during a caucus. So do the ground rules cover how are we going to caucus? There are some platforms such as Zoom that allow for, I don't remember if they call them meeting rooms or breakout rooms, but the host can actually separate participants into different rooms and exclude others from those rooms so that you could have a virtual caucus. The problem there is that if you're recording the meeting, the caucuses get recorded also. So you need to understand how the software works. What do you need to do? What precautions do you need to take in maintaining confidentiality and privacy of your discussions? And then, of course, if you are going to break, how do you resume? Do you exchange text messages or email messages that says, hey, the employer's ready to go, let us know, and we can all dial in again? Or is there a different methodology that you can employ to make that happen? Keep in mind that this is the equivalent of somebody running down the hall and knocking on the door and saying, hey, we're ready to resume. Are you guys ready? No, give us another 10 minutes. Okay, we'll come back in 10 minutes. How do you accomplish that electronically? Finally, although face-to-face negotiations certainly can be fatiguing, I think you need to take into consideration what I call screen fatigue. We can only look at the computer and look at each other on these virtual platforms for so long. So maybe the ground rules limit the length of time that any one session can go on for. Or build in some breaks so that people are not getting fatigued from staring at their screen. And I would also tell you that you should consider doing a test run, and whether you do that with just your committee or with representatives of your committee and the union's committee, I think it's important that everyone be on the same page and understand how the technology works. And of course, that's another investment of time that you need to take into account. So there are a lot of considerations when you're meeting virtually. Now, the flip side of that is I don't even want to deal with the technology. I don't want to deal with the computer. So what do I need to do if I want to meet face to face? Well, the first thing you need to consider is what's the status of the state and local orders that are in place? Does it govern the number of participants at the meeting? Do you need to screen those participants? Can you maintain social distancing? I actually came into my office, our offices this morning for the first time in about 3 weeks. And it's a very different office space than it was 3 weeks ago. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, we have one-way hallways, and instead of being able to access the restrooms from both sides of the office, there's an entry and an exit. So we have what I've kind of jokingly referred to as our one-way bathroom system. There are markers in our conference room that designating how far 6 feet apart is, and there are little X's on the conference table that shows that if there's somebody sitting here, the next closest person can only be on where the next X is, whether it's on the same side of the table or on the other side of the table. There are cleaning restrictions, and we have plenty of wipes and hand sanitizer available. But all of this gives the question of, do we have enough space? And some of your committees are very large. So do you have areas where you can meet jointly with the union, and you have caucus rooms that can accommodate the negotiating committees of both sides? These are considerations that are really controlled by what the state and local governments are requiring. It also may be something that you need to take into consideration just in terms of office space and what individual landlords are requiring. I have some clients that have, and I will say tongue in cheek, in a kicking and screaming fashion, agreed to do their negotiations at the apprentice training facilities. Ordinarily, the employers that I represent are reluctant to go into what they perceive to be as quote unquote the union space to hold these meetings. But these facilities are actually, they provide the space and the distancing requirements that can accommodate negotiations, and many of them, at least in the last several weeks, and maybe a few more weeks going forward, they're closed. They're not being used for apprentice training. So we have space available to us that the parties can take advantage of. And the best part about it is it should be relatively low cost or even free of charge. So we don't have to pay for a hotel ballroom or a large conference room with caucus rooms to facilitate the negotiations. When you're looking at face-to-face meetings, you need to consider whether what your timing is. Maybe you need to schedule shorter meetings, and the big challenge is food service, both from the having it prepared and delivered perspective, and also the ability to, you can no longer put out a tray of sandwiches and say, all right, everyone can, grab a plate and let's, we can share a meal together. So maybe you need to schedule around those kinds of activities. I've had a couple of clients who have consciously either agreed to meet in the morning or in the afternoon, but they do it in such a way so that they agree that they'll meet from 8:30 to 11:30, and everyone is that's either the end of the day or everyone's on their own for lunch and in whatever way, shape, or form they want to do lunch, and then they'll reconvene at 1:30 and they'll go from 1:30 to 4:30 so that they don't have to worry about lunch or dinner. So those are things that again, being forewarned is forearmed, and having those considerations in place really help the negotiations move smoothly. So what have we seen? What's going on? What are the unions doing? And I'm going to start with those that I'm going to call the midterm bargaining issues. But what are the unions that have contracts in place? What have they been doing in light of COVID? And the most frequent activity that we've seen is voluminous information requests about personal protective equipment, other safety precautions, pay and hazard pay, and they're doing a whole lot of digging, all in the guise of, hey, we're entitled to this information because it relates to safety. I've had multiple trade unions. They all must be getting advice from the same place, because the information requests are pretty similar, but there are, they are 3, 4, 5 pages worth of questions, all related to personal protective equipment and safety issues, and all of the requests. I've had some clients that have taken offense to the requests, because the requests come in a form that essentially is accusatory and saying something like, hey, we want to know everything that you're doing with respect to safety, because we don't think that you're taking this seriously, or that you're not providing a safe work environment for our members. At some point, I understand that, and it's hard to read those kinds of accusations, but at some point we need to get past the semantics and move into what our obligations are or may be. Once we get past those information requests for contracts that don't provide that don't have a strong zipper clause, and don't provide for safety or other kinds of COVID-related issues, we've gotten requests for hazard pay, or pay for time spent testing. Think of it almost as a locker room time or uniform changing time. Requests for PPE, information requests, and rules governing common equipment. You use a piece of heavy machinery, and maybe you've got 2 or 3 folks on site that can operate it. What are the safety precautions being taken to make sure that those drivers aren't subject to the spread of the virus? And of course, social distancing. How are we able to maintain social distancing on our work sites? As you get some of these demands, you have to go back up to the legal considerations and understand what is it that we are or might be obligated to bargain over, and what is it that we can dismiss and say, look, we no longer have, or we don't have a duty to bargain over these issues, and why is that? The other issue that has come up over time in this COVID situation for existing agreements is benefit considerations, and what contributions need to be made in order for benefits to continue. So again, the answer, it lies in, what does the collective bargaining agreement say? Are your contributions based on a monthly premium? Hey, we're going to make a contribution of X dollars per month or per week for our employees, or is it contingent on hours worked? And these are, these may not sound like significant issues, but they can be, because if you're delinquent and contributing to these funds, you may put your employee benefits, at issue. And for something like, for example, health and welfare, is the union plan going to deny an employee benefits or coverage in the event that they have a medical need? The other question that comes up from time to time is for employers that have gotten small business loans, PPE loans. What are the requirements of those loans, so that if the if the loan requires that you maintain the terms and conditions of employment for your employees, including benefits, but the CBA does not require you to make benefit contributions on behalf of your employees who are not working, how do you square that off? Because from our perspective, from the employer's perspective, we certainly don't want to do anything that's going to quash our ability to take advantage of the PPP loans and the forgiveness pieces of those loans. Now, I will tell you that generally speaking, the funds have been cooperative in this regard and trying to do what they can within the bounds of the law and the loan requirements to allow employers to make contributions and to make sure that employees maintain their level of benefits. But there does reach a point where the funds have to be cautious in taking actions that isn't going to create some sort of precedent that they don't want to have to deal with in the future. And then, of course, we have contracts that have been expiring, and there are a number of contracts that have expired since the end of February and will be expiring in the next several months. So what are we seeing at the negotiation table? What are we seeing in the in strategically from the unions? Well, the first thing that we're seeing is expanded requests for information. I would expect that most of you get requests for information prior to starting negotiations for a new agreement. We're seeing those normal information requests coming on, but we're also seeing an increase in information requests related to PPE and information trying to get at the economic impact of the shutdowns or decreased work or lost work that might affect contract negotiations. Now, again, I'm here to tell you that some of that information may or may not be relevant to negotiations. I certainly suspect that we would want to push back, employers would want to push back on economic information, and we certainly would want to get a confidentiality and protective order in place regarding any economic information that might be shared. But these are the types of questions that we're seeing. The unions are being aggressive in terms of trying to learn as much as they can about what they might expect in terms of proposals from the employer. In terms of strategy, some employers and some unions have reached an agreement on simply extending the existing contract. I've seen extensions for 6 months, for a year, or an indefinite extension, but it provides for 30 or 60 days notice of termination. And extensions are worthwhile because it really allows both sides to get their arms around what the circumstances might be when they sit down to bargain. So instead of trying to project or predict what might happen 6 months from now, extending the current agreement for 6 months might make sense because it allows us, it allows both sides to assess where are we in that 6 month period. from the employer's perspective, one of the things that I always mention to the employers I work with is, while the extension may seem like a good, easy way out right now, what does that mean for other contracts you may have? Do you have other expiring agreements that could be impacted if you extend the current agreement too far? Are you going to have a couple of trades that you're negotiating with simultaneously that you may have set up the expiration dates intentionally so that you wouldn't have to be, negotiating against both ends of the stick? The unions that are wanting to negotiate and aren't agreeable to an extension, for the most part, most of them are looking to keep pace. And what I mean by that is they're paying very little attention to the pandemic issues and the COVID issues, and they're just approaching the negotiations as they would any other negotiations, where they're looking to get, keep pace with other trades. So if you settled with other trades last year or the year before, where you've provided a 2%, 3%, 4% increase each year of the agreement, the unions are looking to get those same increases. They want to keep pace, and they're not taking into account what the economic implications are of COVID. So while you as the employer may be sitting there with stories of lost work and lost revenues, the added costs of operations because of the PPE that you now need to provide, or the slower pace of operations because of social distancing, those are all costs to your business, and some of the unions are just, they're unaffected by that. Their proposals are typical of past negotiations. So on the economic side, for example, they will come in with pie in the sky kinds of aspirations, looking to, again, keep pace with what they perceive to be kind of the norm. And then you have the unions that are seeking to keep pace and then some. So you're not only getting the, what I would call the typical contract proposals that are primarily economic and maybe some work rule or safety issues that have come up that need to be addressed based on the activities during the last contract, but you're getting proposals on hazard pay or crisis provisions about health and safety and personal protective equipment, or increased allowances for PPE for the employees that may not have surfaced in what I would call your typical negotiations. And in some cases, we've seen some alternate benefits provisions, so that if the contract or if the funds cannot accept contributions from employers on behalf of employees, are there alternatives available through a private insurance fund or a private insurance provider that can provide alternate benefits to keep employees covered in the case of crisis. So these are all kind of new roads for us that some of the more aggressive unions have been pursuing. And finally, the two questions that I get all the time that there really just are not good answers to. The first one is, what can a contractor do to limit their liability for crisis claims? The best advice that I can give is address that through your workers' comp carrier. Perhaps look at short-term or long-term disability coverage as part of that alternative benefit discussion. But the best thing you can do to limit your liability is to make sure that you're following all of the precautions that are handed out at the state and local level to prevent the spread of the virus. There's really there's not much you can do in the form of negotiations other than perhaps negotiate a term into the contract about what benefits or what reinstatement rights an employee that has a confirmed case of the virus or other pandemic type symptoms, how they might get reinstated into the workforce. Certainly, if you have the ability through the contract to limit how quickly or when employees are reinstated, that goes a long way in helping you defend what other crisis claims you may have. The other question I get fairly regularly is, what are contractors who work in multiple jurisdictions? How are they dealing with these issues? For example, I'm based in Chicago. We are obviously very close to the Wisconsin and Indiana borders. So I have clients that do work, north of the border in Wisconsin or over the border in Northwest Indiana. Those states have opened up much more quickly than Illinois has. So I'm getting questions, like how much PPE do I have to provide, and how much can I provide different levels of PPE to folks working in Indiana or Wisconsin than those working in Illinois. And again, I would tell you that those are all subjects for negotiation. And can you propose those kinds of differences? Yes, but I will tell you again, anecdotally, the default appears to be what's the worst case scenario? What are the most stringent requirements? That's what the unions are shooting for. So if Illinois has more stringent PPE requirements than Wisconsin and Indiana, the unions are looking to get that requirement in the contract for all covered members, not just for those working in Illinois. Certainly in bargaining, you can request and carve out anything that the parties are agreeable to, but I would tell you that what you should expect is that the unions are going to want the most stringent jurisdictional requirements to represent the entire bargaining unit. So that's kind of a down and dirty on bargaining considerations and how to engage in bargaining. We've got, looks like we have about 7 or 8 minutes left on our hour. So here's an opportunity to take some questions and answers from you all. I think, Tim, you've been gathering questions, hopefully. So we can
I don't have any at present, Harry, but at this time, if anyone, there is an ability to either raise your hand or if you would care to send something either in the questions or chat box, I'd be happy to call on you and unmute your mic and let you ask directly, whichever you'd care to do, or if you go ahead and want to text a question or two in. While we take a minute or two now, if you weren't aware, within the last 24 hours, Milwaukee Tool has extended a special offer for webinar attendees, and the winner of the whole hog, and that was made available through from Milwaukee Tool. It was the winner of a whole hog is Bill McCall. So we'll be getting in contact with you and putting you together with Ron Shanover for how he can ship you the Milwaukee Tool whole hog. So congratulations to you, Bill. Are there any questions out there? I'm not seeing any hands raised.
And certainly I can tell you my contact information is on the first page of the PowerPoint. Certainly, if you want to give me a call or shoot me an email with questions as they as they arise, I'm happy to respond and provide you with any guidance I can.
All right, any questions? Still not seeing any. All right, again, you've got Harry's address right there on your screen. Harry Seacrest at ogletree.com, and his phone number is right there. Any other questions, you can also refer to me. My address is Penno, P-E-N-N-O, at naphcc.org. Again, I'd like to take this time to thank both of our sponsors, Bradford White Corporation, as well as Milwaukee Tool. I'd like to thank you for your attendance and your participation today, and look forward to displaying this. This webcast will be available on the COVID-19 Recovery Center page over at phccweb.org, and it'll be among all of the other webinars that are located under the Recovery Webinar Series. So you can take a look at all of the other webinars and at your leisure, view and gain information that way. There's nothing else, I guess. Thank you again to Harry Seacrest and to also to Sean Kahn and Ron Shanover for their participation today. Thank you so much. Have a great afternoon.